For just one sheep I'd marry her, Billy used to say when talking about women, prompting laughter among the men who gathered in the Cedar Ridge Hall. Billy Thompson rode along the dusty road that led into town, his elongated shadow dancing over the land parched by the relentless midday sun. The wind carried the smell of mugwort and the promise of another scorching day in the Arizona territory. His calloused hands held the reins with the familiarity of someone who had spent his entire life mounted, while his clear eyes scanned the horizon for signs of trouble. Like so many men in the West, Billy learned early on that caution kept a man breathing longer than unbridled courage. The Morrison Ranch was 3 miles from town, tucked away among low hills covered with cacti and thorny bushes. Billy had received a message from James Morrison the morning before, asking him to come and talk about a job. Morrison was known for paying well, but also for being picky about those he hired. Few men could work for him for long without some disagreement arising. Billy, however, had a reputation for being reliable and discreet, valuable qualities in a territory where secrets could outweigh gold. When he spotted the Morrison farmhouse, Billy slowed his horse's pace. The property stretched across acres of barren land, dotted with well-constructed corrals and a windmill that spun lazily against the cloudless blue sky. The main house was solid, made of sturdy wood that had survived harsh winters and brutal summers. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone was preparing lunch. Billy dismounted near the front gate, tied the reins to the fence post, and walked toward the porch. His footsteps echoed in the oppressive silence of the afternoon, interrupted only by the distant hum of insects and the occasional mooing of cattle grazing in the distant fields. Before she could knock on the door, she opened, revealing a female figure that made Billy stop in mid-motion. The woman standing before him had brown hair that caught the sunlight like strands of polished copper. His green eyes were as deep as artesian wells, and there was a mixture of shyness and determination in them that Billy had never seen before. She wore a simple blue cotton dress, but she carried herself with a dignity that transformed ordinary dress into something almost elegant. When he smiled, Billy felt as if the world had shrunk in size, focusing only on that moment, on that balcony, on those green eyes. "You must be Billy Thompson," she said in a melodious voice that seemed to be completely out of step with the harshness of the surrounding environment. "Dad is waiting for you at the office. I'm Sarah Morrison." Billy took off his hat, revealing dark hair slightly scruffy from the wind. For a moment he seemed to have forgotten how to speak, just staring at the young woman with an expression that mixed surprise and something he couldn't name. Finally he found his voice, although it came out a little hoarser than usual. "Mrs. Morrison," he managed to say, bowing slightly, "it's a pleasure to meet you." Sarah pointed the way through the house, walking ahead of her through the well-kept corridors. Billy followed her, noticing how she moved with natural grace, her soft steps contrasting with the heavy clatter of his boots on the wooden floor. The walls were decorated with family photographs and some simple paintings of Western landscapes, creating a welcoming atmosphere that Billy rarely encountered on his wanderings. James Morrison was sitting behind a solid oak desk when Billy entered the office. He was a stout man with a neatly trimmed grey beard and eyes that had seen many seasons pass by. He stood up to greet Billy with a firm handshake, the kind of greeting the men of the West used to measure each other. "Billy, thank you for coming," Morrison said, indicating a leather chair in front of the table. "I have a proposal that may interest you. I need someone to escort Sarah to Santa Fe. She will marry Judge Patterson's son in 3 weeks. Morrison's words hit Billy like a punch in the gut. He looked at Sarah, who had stood at the door of the office, and saw a shadow pass through her green eyes. She lowered her gaze quickly, as if to hide something Billy couldn't fully decipher. "It's a 5-day trip," Morrison continued, seemingly oblivious to the impact his revelation had had on Billy. "I pay $50, plus travel expenses. Sarah will only take a maid for company, so I need someone I can completely trust." Billy forced himself to keep his composure, though he felt as if the ground had moved under his feet. $50 was more money than he used to see at one time, enough to keep him comfortably for several months. But the thought of escorting Sarah Morrison to her wedding to another man made his stomach churn in a way he didn't expect. "When do you intend to leave?" asked Billy, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Next Monday at dawn," Morrison replied. "Sarah wants to arrive in Santa Fe with enough time to properly prepare for the ceremony. Judge Patterson is an important man, and everything needs to be perfect." Billy nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Sarah's again. This time she didn't look away immediately, and for a brief moment he thought he saw something there that made his heart race dangerously. There was a subtle sadness in her expression, as if she carried a weight that no one else could see. "I take the job," Billy said finally, knowing he was making a decision that could complicate his life in ways he couldn't yet predict. Morrison smiled, clearly pleased with the answer. He held out his hand again, sealing the deal with another firm grip. Sarah remained silent, but Billy noticed that her hands were clasped in front of her body, her knuckles slightly white from the pressure. As they discussed the details of the trip, necessary provisions, safer routes, stopping points, Billy found himself dividing his attention between Morrison's words and Sarah's quiet presence. She had approached the window and looked out at the barren landscape outside, her delicate profile jagged against the golden afternoon light. There was something about her posture that suggested melancholy, as if she was contemplating more than just the distant hills. When the arrangements were finalized, Morrison escorted Billy to the front door. Sarah had disappeared at some point during the conversation, and Billy felt her absence as a strange sense of emptiness. He mounted his horse under the sun that was beginning to decline, knowing that the coming week would be unlike anything he had experienced before. As he rode back to Cedar Ridge, Billy couldn't get Sarah Morrison out of his thoughts. There was something about her that challenged her simple philosophy about women and marriage. Not only was she beautiful, though she certainly was, but she possessed an indefinable quality that made Billy question his own convictions about staying single and free of commitment. The sun was setting when he arrived in town, painting the sky with shades of orange and red that reflected his confused state of mind. Billy knew he had taken on more than just an escort job. He had accepted 5 days in the company of a woman who, in a few hours, had managed to shake the foundations of his carefully structured existence. That night, as he prepared to sleep in the rented room above the hall, Billy looked out the window toward the hills where the Morrison ranch once stood. Somewhere in that direction, Sarah Morrison was probably preparing for her last week as a single woman, and Billy couldn't decide whether he was anxious or terrified by the prospect of spending the next few days by her side. The night wind brought with it the aroma of mugwort and the promise of changes that Billy was not yet ready to face. Monday arrived, shrouded in a cold mist that rose from the ground like ghosts reluctant to leave the land. Billy arrived at the Morrison ranch when the first dawn lights were still battling the shadows of the night, his breath forming small clouds in the icy air. He had slept badly all week, plagued by thoughts he couldn't organize and feelings he preferred not to name. Sarah Morrison waited on the porch, a figure draped in a dark wool shawl that made her look even more ethereal in the uncertain pre-dawn light. A small carriage was prepared next to the house, loaded with chests and provisions for the journey. Next to her was an older woman, clearly the servant girl Morrison mentioned, a middle-aged lady with keen eyes and a stiff demeanor who suggested years of experience caring for young ladies. Billy dismounted and checked the carriage's harnesses with the meticulousness of someone who knew that small details could mean the difference between a smooth ride and a disaster. The wheels were well oiled, the horses seemed rested and well fed, and the provisions were properly distributed to balance the weight. As he worked, he felt Sarah's eyes on him, a silent weight that made him move with a strange awareness of every gesture. James Morrison left the house carrying a shotgun and a belt with ammunition. He handed the guns to Billy with a serious look that needed no words to convey his message. The road to Santa Fe ran through wilderness territory, where bandits and hostile natives posed constant threats to unprotected travelers. Morrison trusted Billy not only to guide his daughter through the miles of barren land, but to protect her with his own life if necessary. The farewell between father and daughter was brief, but full of contained emotion. Morrison hugged Sarah for a long moment, whispering words that Billy couldn't hear, but whose fatherly tone was unmistakable. Sarah nodded several times, her eyes shining with unshed tears that she clearly struggled to control. There was a courageous dignity to her composure that made Billy admire her even more, even though he knew that admiration would only make the next few days more difficult. When they finally left, the sun had risen completely, turning the landscape into a golden expanse of rolling hills and dry valleys. Billy rode ahead of the carriage, alternating his attention between the road ahead and the veil of dust that rose behind them. The rhythmic sound of horses' hooves and the occasional creaking of carriage wheels created a monotonous melody that seemed to mark not only the distance traveled, but also the time that remained before Sarah Morrison became Sarah Patterson. For the first few hours of the trip, Sarah remained in almost complete silence, lost in thoughts that Billy could only imagine. Occasionally, he would watch her through the reflection in a puddle of water, or when he turned to check if the carriage was keeping up with him. She looked at the passing landscape with a thoughtful expression, as if she were memorizing every detail of the land she left behind. The maid, whom Billy discovered to be called Martha, proved to be a practical and discreet traveling companion. She took care of Sarah's needs with quiet efficiency, arranging rest and meal stops with the experience of someone who had made similar trips before. There was a maternal protection in her posture towards the young lady that Billy respected, recognizing in her an ally in the task of keeping Sarah safe during the journey. At the end of the first day, they stopped at a clearing next to a stream that meandered between moss-covered rocks. Billy set up camp with precise movements, lighting a small but efficient fire that provided warmth without creating too much smoke that might attract unwanted attention. As she brewed coffee in a kettle blackened by use, she watched Sarah walking along the edge of the stream, her careful footsteps on the damp stones. She had taken off her shawl and left her hair down, allowing the night breeze to move it gently around her shoulders. The light of the campfire danced on his face, creating shadows that accentuated the delicacy of his features. Billy forced himself to look away, concentrating on the task of checking the weapons and planning the next day's route. But even when he wasn't looking directly at her, he felt her presence like an electric current in the cold night air. Martha served a simple meal of jerky, biscuits, and beans, which they consumed in contemplative silence around the campfire. Sarah ate little, pushing the food on her plate with a lack of appetite that did not go unnoticed by Billy. There was a growing melancholy in his posture that worried him, though he did not know how to approach it without crossing the proper boundaries between a hired guide and his client. When it was time to sleep, Billy arranged the blankets so that Martha and Sarah had adequate privacy near the carriage, while he himself positioned himself on the other side of the fire, where he could keep vigil over the camp. The stars shone with an intensity that was only possible away from the city lights, creating a shimmering canopy that made the world seem both infinite and intimately small. Billy remained awake for hours after the two women fell asleep, feeding the fire with dry branches and listening to the nighttime sounds of the desert. Coyotes howled in the distance, their primal melody echoing through the hills like an ancestral lament. From time to time, he would look in the direction where Sarah slept, protected by the darkness and the blankets, and he felt a strange mixture of protection and desire that made him uneasy. The second day brought more intense heat, with the sun beating relentlessly over the arid landscape. Billy adjusted the pace of the trip to accommodate the rising temperatures, making more frequent stops in the shade of rocks or lonely trees. During one of these stops, he noticed that Sarah had approached him while checking his horse's hooves for rocks. She remained close in silence, watching him work with an attention that made Billy aware of his every move. When he raised his eyes, he found hers fixed on his face, with an intensity that made him momentarily forget what he was doing. There was something about his expression that felt like an unasked question, a search for something he didn't know if he could or should provide. Martha interrupted the moment by calling Sarah to check something in the carriage, but the look she directed at Billy before walking away carried a weight that he continued to feel long after she had walked away. It was as if, in that brief, silent exchange, something fundamental had changed between them, though neither of them could name exactly what it was. As the miles passed under the wheels of the carriage, Billy began to notice small changes in Sarah's behavior. She talked more with Martha, occasionally laughing at the maid's remarks about the landscape or about small incidents of the trip. But there was a forced quality to her joy, as if she was striving to maintain a spirit she didn't genuinely feel. During the afternoon of the third day, when they stopped to rest near a rocky outcrop that provided blessed shade, Billy watched Sarah move away from the makeshift camp. She walked to a nearby elevation and stood there looking in the direction they had come from. Her posture suggested a deep longing, as if she were saying goodbye to something more than just the familiar landscape. Billy found himself following her before he could think better about the propriety of such an action. He approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance, but close enough for her to know of his presence. Sarah didn't turn when she heard him coming, but her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if his presence brought some comfort. They remained like this for several minutes, two silhouettes against the immense sky, sharing a moment of mutual understanding that transcended the need for words. Billy felt that there was something Sarah wanted to say, something important that she kept inside her as a precious and painful secret. But he also knew that he could not force this revelation, that it would come at the right time, or not at all. When Sarah finally turned to return to camp, her eyes met Billy's for an instant that seemed to last an eternity. There were tears held back there, and a vulnerability that made his heart tighten in a way he had never experienced before. She passed him without a word, but the subtle fragrance of his perfume lingered in the air like an unfulfilled promise. That night, as the campfire crackled and the stars emerged one by one in the darkened sky, Billy remained awake thinking about the 2 days left of travel. He knew he was getting dangerously close to feelings that could complicate not only this journey, but his entire carefully structured existence. Sarah Morrison was destined for another man, for a life that didn't include wandering cowboys with complicated pasts and uncertain futures. But even knowing this, Billy couldn't ignore the growing certainty that something was going on between them, something that transcended the circumstances of their temporary association. And as he fueled the fire with more firewood, preparing for another night of lonely vigil, he began to suspect that the secret Sarah carried could change everything he thought he knew about love, duty, and the choices that define a man's destiny. The 4th day dawned with heavy clouds accumulating on the horizon, promising the first rain in weeks. Billy watched the sky with concern as he prepared the horses, knowing that a storm could turn the roads into rivers of mud and significantly delay his arrival in Santa Fe. Sarah noticed his uneasiness and, for the first time on the trip, approached him voluntarily, her soft footsteps over the dry land breaking the morning silence. She stood by his side, watching the dark clouds that moved slowly towards them, and Billy noticed that there was a subtle change in his posture. The melancholy of the previous days had been replaced by something that seemed like determination, as if she had made some important decision during the night. Her green eyes shone with an intensity he hadn't seen before, and when she turned to look at him, Billy felt as if she was about to reveal something significant. Martha appeared from the carriage carrying an extra blanket and commented on the possibility of rain with the practicality of someone who had faced many storms on her travels. But Billy noticed that she also watched Sarah with special attention, as if she noticed the change in her young lady's mood. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the weather, an electricity that made Billy feel restless in a way he couldn't fully explain. They left earlier than usual, hoping to cover more distance before the rain came. The landscape had gradually changed during the past few days, with the barren hills giving way to greener valleys where small streams fed grazing areas. It was a friendlier land, which suggested the proximity of civilization and the end of their journey together. Billy should have felt relieved to be approaching Santa Fe, but instead each mile traveled seemed to add a weight to his chest. Sarah had become less reserved during the morning, making occasional observations of the landscape and asking Billy about his experience traveling through these lands. His questions were intelligent and demonstrated a genuine curiosity about the life he led, an interest that went beyond mere courtesy. Billy found himself answering in more detail than usual, sharing stories about places he had visited and people he had met on his wanderings. When they stopped for lunch next to a grove of aspens that offered protection from the rising wind, Sarah surprised Billy by asking to walk with him while he scanned the surroundings for signs of danger. Martha seemed hesitant to allow such an arrangement, but something in Sarah's determined expression made her reluctantly acquiesce. Billy and Sarah walked together for the first time since the start of the trip, their steps creating a joint rhythm on the dry leaves that covered the ground. The conversation between them flowed more naturally than Billy had anticipated. Sarah asked questions about his family, his past, his plans for the future, questions he rarely discussed with strangers, but which felt natural coming from her. In return, she began to talk about her life on the ranch, about the responsibilities she had always carried as an only child, about dreams she had kept silent for years. There was a confessional quality to her words that made Billy realize that she was sharing things she had probably never said to anyone. As they walked, Billy began to understand that Sarah Morrison was much more than the obedient young lady he had initially known. She possessed a keen intelligence and opinions of her own on many issues, from territorial politics to philosophies about freedom and responsibility. There was an inner strength in her that had been carefully concealed under the facade of proper femininity, a strength that Billy suspected few had had the privilege of witnessing. When they returned to camp, Billy noticed that Martha was watching them with an expression that mixed concern and understanding. The maid had clearly perceived something different in the interaction between them, something that transcended the proper relationship between a hired guide and his client. Billy tried to keep his expression neutral, but he knew that his feelings were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. The afternoon brought the first drops of rain, large drops that created small craters in the dry dust, and filled the air with the earthy aroma characteristic of desert storms. Billy quickened the pace of the trip, hoping to find shelter before the rain intensified. But the storm arrived with the sudden fury typical of the region, turning the world into a curtain of water that reduced visibility to a few meters. Billy guided the carriage to a rock formation that offered partial protection from wind and rain. It was an imperfect shelter, but enough to keep them relatively dry while the storm passed. Martha and Sarah took refuge in the carriage, while Billy tended to the horses and arranged his provisions to prevent them from getting completely wet. The sound of rain against the rocks and the canvas of the carriage created a constant drumming that drowned out any attempt at conversation. During the hours that followed, trapped in the makeshift shelter, Billy noticed that Sarah watched him with increasing intensity. There was something in her eyes that suggested an inner struggle, as if she were debating with herself about some important issue. Martha had fallen asleep in a corner of the carriage, effectively leaving them alone for the first time since the beginning of the journey. The closeness forced by the storm created an intimacy that made Billy painfully aware of Sarah's every breath, every move. By the time the rain finally subsided to a light drizzle, it was too late to continue the journey that day. Billy set up a more elaborate camp than usual, taking advantage of the rainwater to replenish his supplies and prepare a more substantial meal. Sarah offered to help, working alongside them with a familiarity that felt natural, as if they had been long-time partners rather than recent acquaintances. As they prepared the food together, their hands occasionally touched each other as they reached for the same utensils, creating moments of electrical contact that made Billy momentarily forget what he was doing. Sarah didn't shy away from these accidental touches, and Billy began to suspect that they might not be as accidental as they seemed. There was a growing tension between them that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. After the meal, Martha retired early to the carriage, claiming fatigue from the turbulent journey. Billy suspected that the maid was deliberately giving them privacy, an assumption that was confirmed when Sarah made no move to accompany her. Instead, she remained seated by the campfire, staring out at the flames with a thoughtful expression that made Billy want to ask about her thoughts. The silence between them was different from previous silences, fraught with unexplored possibilities and unspoken words. Billy fed the fire with more wood than necessary, using the activity as an excuse to stay close to Sarah. She seemed to be mustering up the courage for something, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her shawl as she stared alternately at the fire and at him. Finally, Sarah got up abruptly and walked to the edge of her makeshift camp where the light of the campfire could barely reach. Billy followed her instinctively, driven by a concern he couldn't fully explain. She was standing with her back to him, her shoulders tense under the wet shawl, and as he approached she could hear the ragged breathing that suggested suppressed tears. When Sarah finally turned to face him, Billy saw that his suspicions were correct. Tears glistened in his green eyes, reflecting the distant light of the campfire. But there was something else in his expression, a desperate determination that alarmed him. She opened her mouth as if to speak, closed it again, and then, suddenly, the words came out in a torrent that changed everything. Sarah Morrison was not a virgin, as one would expect of a respectable bride. She had given herself to a young cowboy 2 years earlier, a man who had promised to marry her, and then disappeared without a trace when he found out she was pregnant. The pregnancy had ended in miscarriage during the 3rd month, but the experience had left scars that went far beyond the physical. Her father never knew the truth, believing that her recent melancholy was just premarital nervousness. The words fell between them like stones thrown into still water, creating shockwaves that Billy felt in every fiber of his being. Sarah had trusted him with the secret that could destroy not only her impending marriage, but her entire reputation and future. There was a desperate courage in her confession that made Billy admire her even more, even as he processed the devastating implications of what she had revealed. Sarah kept speaking, her words coming out in an urgent whisper that only he could hear. She didn't love Judge Patterson's son. She never would. The marriage had been arranged by her father as a way to secure her future, but she knew she was condemning herself to a life of pretense and unhappiness. He had spent the last days of the journey trying to find the courage to flee, to choose poverty and dishonor over a loveless union. Billy listened to it all in silence, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear him. When Sarah finally stopped speaking, they stood before each other in partial darkness, the weight of her revelation hanging between them like a tangible presence. Billy knew that this was the moment that would define not only the remainder of the trip, but possibly the rest of their lives. The choices they made in the next hour would determine whether Sarah Morrison arrived in Santa Fe as a dutiful bride or disappeared into the vastness of the West as a free woman. The fire crackled behind them, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the turbulence of their thoughts. Billy slowly reached out, gently touching Sarah's moist face, and felt her lean into his touch like a flower toward the sun. In that moment, he knew that no matter what the consequences were, he wouldn't allow her to face her fate alone. The dawn of the fifth day brought a crystalline clarity that made everything seem newly created. Billy woke up knowing that his life had changed irreversibly during the night. Sarah slept peacefully in the carriage, her face serene for the first time since the beginning of the journey, as if the confession had released a weight she had carried for years. Martha watched Billy with knowing eyes as he made his morning coffee. The maid had served the Morrison family long enough to recognize the signs of a woman in love, and there was enough wisdom in her years not to ask unnecessary questions. When Sarah emerged from the carriage, there was a new light in her green eyes that confirmed Martha's silent suspicions. The city of Santa Fe appeared on the horizon like a mirage made a reality, its adobe buildings gilded by the morning sun, contrasting with the distant mountains. Billy slowed down the horses unconsciously, as if he could delay the inevitable. Sarah had remained close to him all morning, riding beside him instead of in the carriage, and Martha had made no objection to this breach of protocol. When they finally stopped in the vicinity of the city, Billy dismounted and walked over to Sarah, who had remained mounted looking at the church towers that rose above the rooftops. He stretched out his arms to help her down, and when she let herself slide toward the ground, she lingered for a moment between his arms, her eyes fixed on his with an intensity that spoke more than 1,000 words. Martha discreetly stepped aside to check the luggage, allowing them a final moment of intimacy. Sarah gently touched Billy's face, her fingers tracing the lines the sun and wind had etched into his skin. There was a farewell in that ring, but also a silent promise that made his heart race with possibilities he didn't dare name. The decision, when it came, was simple and inevitable as the arrival of dawn. Sarah Morrison would not enter Santa Fe as a dutiful bride. She would set off with Billy Thompson toward the western horizon, where uncharted territories offered the promise of new beginnings and the freedom to write her own rules. Billy helped her get only a small suitcase out of the carriage, leaving the elaborate trunks and wedding dresses for Martha to deliver to the Patterson family, along with a letter Sarah had written during the night. The letter explained his decision without revealing secrets that could harm others, taking full responsibility for his choice to abandon a secure future in favor of an uncertain love. Martha hugged Sarah with tears in her eyes, whispering blessings and practical advice about the life she had chosen. The loyal maid would keep her young lady's secrets until the end of her days, understanding that some choices could only be made by her own heart. As Billy prepared his horses for a journey with no definite destination, Sarah looked one last time toward Santa Fe. There was no regret in his eyes, only the serene determination of someone who had finally found the courage to live on his own terms. They set out as the sun reached its zenith, two lone figures against the immensity of the American West. Billy had traded his simple philosophy about marriage for something infinitely more complex and precious. Sarah Morrison had discovered that true wealth was not measured in land or social status, but in the freedom to choose one's own destiny. The road stretched out ahead of them like a blank promise, ready to be filled with adventures, challenges, and a love that had been born under the merciless desert sun. Martha stood still long after they disappeared over the horizon, holding the letter that would change many lives and smiling through her tears. For just one sheep, Billy used to say he would get married, but for Sarah Morrison he was willing to trade everything he owned for the chance to build something true in the wild vastness of the West. And as they rode into the unknown, they both knew that they had found something more valuable than all the gold in the territory. They had found each other. If this journey of love and courage into the wild heart of the American West has awakened something in you, then get ready to ride with us through more epic adventures where men and women face impossible choices under the relentless sun of the territory. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of these exciting stories that explore the limits of human nature. And leave your comment below telling which moment in this saga between Billy and Sarah touched your heart the most. It was her courage in revealing her secret, his transformation in discovering true love, or that final moment when they decided to exchange security for freedom together towards the infinite horizon of the West.